New York in 1870. A Journey Through the City at the Dawn of the Gilded Age. Chapter 1. The Physical Landscape of a Rapidly Transforming City. Standing at the southern tip of Manhattan Island in 1870, a visitor would encounter a city dramatically different from the New York we recognize today. The metropolis that would eventually become America's greatest urban center was still confined largely to the lower portions of Manhattan, with development thinning considerably above 42nd Street. The entire island measured roughly 13 miles long and 2 miles wide, yet most New Yorkers lived and worked in the crowded wards south of 14th Street. The city's population had exploded in recent decades, reaching approximately 942,000 residents by 1870, making it the largest city in the United States and one of the 10 largest cities in the world. The dramatic growth had transformed New York from a mercantile seaport into an increasingly industrial powerhouse, though the transition remained incomplete and uneven across different neighborhoods. The physical infrastructure of the city reflected this rapid, often chaotic expansion. Streets in lower Manhattan followed the irregular colonial pattern, winding and narrow, creating a labyrinth of commercial activity. Further north, the grid system established by the Commissioner's Plan of 1811 imposed geometric order, with avenues running north-south and non-numbered streets crossing east-west. This rational layout, however, could not prevent the density and congestion that characterized daily life. Broadway remained the city's principal thoroughfare, a bustling artery of commerce that ran the length of Manhattan. Along this famous street, buildings of varying heights and architectural styles crowded together. The tallest structures reached perhaps 5 or 6 stories, as elevator technology remained in its infancy, and construction techniques limited vertical ambitions. Cast iron facades had become fashionable in commercial districts, their prefabricated elements allowing for larger windows and more ornate decoration than traditional masonry construction. The waterfront defined much of the city's character and economy. Both the East River and Hudson River shores bristled with piers, warehouses, and shipyards. Sailing vessels still dominated the harbor, though steamships grew more numerous each year. The forest of masts, visible from any elevated vantage point, testified to New York's position as America's premier port, handling more cargo and passenger traffic than any competitor. Central Park represented the city's most ambitious attempt to impose nature upon the urban landscape. Designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vose, the park had been under construction since 1857, and by 1870, much of its landscape had matured into the pastoral vision its creators intended. The park stretched from 59th Street to 110th Street, covering 843 acres that had previously been rocky, swampy terrain dotted with squatters' settlements. Now it offered New Yorkers lakes, meadows, wooded paths, and carefully designed vistas that seemed to transport visitors far from the surrounding city. Yet the park also highlighted the stark divisions within New York society. While wealthy families paraded through in elegant carriages, working-class New Yorkers often found the park's location inconvenient and its rules restrictive. The vision of democratic public space confronted the realities of a deeply stratified city. Water presented ongoing challenges for the growing metropolis. The Croton Aqueduct, completed in 1842, brought fresh water from reservoirs in Westchester County, terminating at the receiving reservoir where the New York Public Library now stands. This engineering achievement had dramatically improved public health, yet distribution remained uneven, and many tenement dwellers still relied on shared pumps or purchased water from vendors. The city's relationship with its surrounding waters extended beyond practical concerns. New York Harbor served as the gateway through which millions of immigrants entered America. Castle Garden, at the Battery on Manhattan's southern tip, functioned as the immigration processing center, handling hundreds of thousands of new arrivals annually. These immigrants, predominantly from Ireland and Germany in 1870, profoundly shaped the city's demographics, culture, and politics. Brooklyn, though technically a separate city, maintained such close connections with Manhattan that the two functioned as parts of a single metropolitan area. Ferry services shuttled passengers across the East River throughout the day, and ambitious plans for a suspension bridge linking the two cities had generated considerable excitement, though construction would not begin until 1870. The built environment reflected not just growth but growing pains. Sanitation infrastructure struggled to keep pace with population increases. While newer areas enjoyed some sewerage, older neighborhoods relied on privies and cesspools that frequently contaminated water supplies. Streets in poorer districts became repositories for garbage, animal waste, and industrial effluent, creating both health hazards and overwhelming sensory experiences. Gas lighting had transformed nighttime in more prosperous neighborhoods. Lamp posts lined major streets, their flickering flames extending the hours of commerce and entertainment. Yet many side streets and poorer areas remained dark after sunset, creating spaces of danger and mystery that spawned countless urban legends and very real criminal activity. The city's vertical ambitions remained modest by later standards, but taller buildings were beginning to appear. The Equitable Life Building, completed in 1870 at 120 Broadway, rose 7 stories and featured one of the city's first passenger elevators, hinting at future possibilities. Church spires still dominated the skyline, with Trinity Church's 281-foot tower remaining the city's tallest structure, visible from throughout Lower Manhattan, and serving as a landmark for ships entering the harbor. Chapter 2. The Social Fabric and Class Divisions. New York in 1870 was a city of stark contrasts, where extreme wealth and desperate poverty existed in close proximity, often within blocks of each other. The social landscape mirrored the physical one, creating a complex tapestry of classes, ethnicities, and cultures that coexisted with varying degrees of tension and cooperation. At the apex of society stood the old aristocratic families, sometimes called the Knickerbockers, after Washington Irving's satirical history. These descendants of Dutch and English colonial settlers guarded their status jealously, maintaining exclusive social circles centered around institutions like the Union Club and events such as Mrs. Astor's famous balls. In doing so, their wealth derived from accumulated land holdings, mercantile ventures, and increasingly from strategic investments in the city's explosive growth. Yet this old guard faced challenges from new money, the entrepreneurs, and industrialists who had accumulated vast fortunes during and after the Civil War. Men like Cornelius Vanderbilt, who controlled much of the city's rail access, and Jim Fisk and Jay Gould, notorious for their financial manipulations, possessed wealth that rivaled or exceeded the old families but lacked their social pedigree. This tension between established aristocracy and upstart plutocracy animated much of high society's drama. The wealthy lived in townhouses along Fifth Avenue and in elegant neighborhoods like Washington Square and Gramercy Park. These residences featured the latest conveniences, elaborate furnishings imported from Europe, and staffs of servants who maintained standards of luxury that rivaled European nobility. Social life revolved around carefully choreographed rituals, formal dinners, opera attendance, carriage rides through Central Park, and summer retreats to Newport or Saratoga Springs. Below this narrow elite stretched a growing middle class of merchants, professionals, clerks, and skilled artisans. These New Yorkers aspired to respectability and comfort, investing heavily in proper dress, decent housing, and their children's education. They inhabited brownstone row houses in neighborhoods like Chelsea and the developing areas of the Upper East and West Sides, spaces that buffered them from both the Mansion District and the slums. Middle-class life centered on domesticity and self-improvement. Churches played crucial social roles, providing not just spiritual guidance but networks of association and charitable activity. Voluntary associations flourished, from literary societies to fraternal organizations, creating spaces for social interaction and mutual support. The expanding public school system offered middle-class families hope that their children might rise higher on the social ladder. Working-class New Yorkers comprised the majority of the city's population, their labor powering the docks, factories, construction sites, and households that kept the metropolis functioning. Their experiences varied considerably based on skill level, ethnicity, and employment stability. Skilled craftsmen like printers, carpenters, and machinists might earn respectable wages and maintain some economic security, often joining trade unions that advocated for their interests. Unskilled laborers faced far more precarious circumstances. Longshoremen, hod carriers, and factory workers endured dangerous conditions, irregular employment, and wages that barely sustained survival. Women and children contributed to family incomes through domestic service, piecework garment production, and factory labor, often under exploitative conditions that reformers were just beginning to document and protest. Housing conditions for the working poor ranged from merely inadequate to appalling. Tenement buildings packed families into cramped, poorly ventilated apartments. The infamous railroad flat design placed rooms in a line from front to back, leaving interior bedrooms without windows or natural light. Multiple families often shared single apartments, and landlords subdivided spaces to extract maximum rent from desperate tenants. The Five Points neighborhood in Lower Manhattan exemplified urban poverty at its worst. Once a respectable area, it had deteriorated into a district notorious for overcrowding, vice, and violence. Its population consisted primarily of Irish immigrants and African Americans, groups marginalized in different ways by the dominant society. Reformers described Five Points with horror, using its conditions to argue for various improvements while often reinforcing prejudices against its inhabitants. African Americans occupied an especially difficult position in New York's social hierarchy. Despite the formal end of slavery in New York State decades earlier, racial discrimination pervaded employment, housing, and social interaction. Most black New Yorkers found themselves relegated to low-paying service positions, and the draft riots of 1863 had demonstrated the violent racism that could erupt from white working-class communities. Small communities of successful black professionals and business owners existed, but they faced constant barriers and threats. The city's immigrant populations had created distinct ethnic neighborhoods where language, culture, and mutual support networks helped newcomers adapt to American urban life. Little Germany on the Lower East Side housed the city's substantial German population, who maintained newspapers, churches, beer gardens, and social organizations that preserved their cultural identity while facilitating integration into the broader economy. Irish immigrants dominated many working-class neighborhoods, particularly in areas like the 6th Ward. Their experience in New York combined economic hardship with growing political power. By 1870, Irish Americans had gained considerable influence in the city's Democratic Party machine, using political connections to secure jobs and protection. This political success, however, often came at the cost of perpetuating corrupt systems that ultimately harmed broader reform efforts. Social reformers worried constantly about the moral condition of the poor, particularly regarding alcohol consumption, prostitution, and crime. Temperance advocates argued that drink destroyed working-class families and prevented economic advancement. Religious organizations established missions in poor neighborhoods, offering material assistance alongside evangelism. The tension between genuine charitable concern and moralistic judgment characterized much reform activity. Gender relations reflected Victorian ideals and that confined middle and upper class women to domestic spheres, while working class women's economic necessity forced them into public work. The cult of domesticity celebrated women as moral guardians of the home, but this ideology had little relevance for women who needed to earn wages. Early feminist activists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, both connected to New York, were beginning to challenge these limitations, though their movement remained small and controversial. Children's experiences varied dramatically by class. Wealthy children enjoyed education, leisure, and protection from labor. Middle-class families invested heavily in their children's schooling and moral development. Working-class children often contributed to family income from young ages, selling newspapers, working in factories, or learning trades. Street children, orphaned or abandoned, survived through a combination of petty crime, begging, and mutual support, their plight inspiring early child welfare efforts. Social mobility remained possible, but difficult. Success stories of immigrants or poor youth rising to wealth and respectability circulated widely, reinforcing American myths of opportunity. Yet structural barriers, particularly regarding ethnicity and race, constrained most people's prospects. The reality was that class positions tended to reproduce themselves across generations, despite the democratic rhetoric that pervaded American culture. Chapter 3: Economic Life and the World of Work. The New York economy in 1870 hummed with diverse activities that made it the commercial and financial capital of the United States. The city's economic life encompassed everything from massive shipping operations to small workshops, from glittering retail establishments to grimy factories, creating a complex ecosystem of production, distribution, and exchange. The port remained central to New York's prosperity. The harbor handled more than half of all American foreign trade, with ships arriving from Europe, South America, Asia, and coastal American ports. The waterfront employed tens of thousands of workers who loaded and unloaded cargo, built and repaired vessels, and managed the logistics of global commerce. Warehouses lined the waterfront streets, storing goods that flowed through the city to destinations throughout the continent. Shipping companies maintained offices in Lower Manhattan, where merchants negotiated deals, arranged insurance, and coordinated complex international transactions. The maritime trades supported entire communities of workers with specialized skills: sailmakers, rope makers, ship carpenters, and chandlers who supplied vessels with necessary provisions. The working waterfront was a world unto itself, with its own customs, hierarchies, and culture. Manufacturing had grown dramatically in the decades leading to 1870, transforming New York from primarily a commercial center into an industrial city. Garment production dominated, with thousands of workers, predominantly women, sewing clothing in factories and tenement workshops. The ready-made clothing industry had expanded enormously during the Civil War, and New York's manufacturers now dressed much of America. Conditions in garment workshops varied widely, from relatively decent factory floors to sweated tenement spaces where workers labored for piece-rate wages under oppressive conditions. Printing and publishing represented another major industry. New York's newspapers, magazines, and book publishers served national markets, and the skilled typesetters, pressmen, and bookbinders who produced these publications formed some of the city's strongest craft unions. Publishing houses clustered around Printing House Square near City Hall, creating a district devoted to the written word. Sugar refining, tobacco processing, ironworks, breweries, and distilleries dotted the cityscape, their smokestacks contributing to the pall that often hung over industrial districts. These establishments transformed raw materials into finished products, providing employment for thousands while generating pollution that degraded air and water quality. Factory work meant long hours, often 60 or more per week, in environments that ranged from merely uncomfortable to actively dangerous. Small workshops and artisan shops still characterized much production. Furniture makers, shoemakers, hatters, and countless other craftsmen maintained businesses that combined traditional skills with evolving technologies and market demands. These smaller operations faced increasing pressure from larger competitors who could produce goods more cheaply through subdivision of labor and mechanization. Retail trade flourished along Broadway and other commercial streets. Department stores like A.T. Stewart's represented a new model of shopping, offering vast selections of goods under one roof with fixed prices and the promise of honest dealing. These palaces of consumption catered primarily to middle and upper-class shoppers, creating spectacular displays that transformed purchasing into entertainment. The Stewart store, located on Broadway between 9th and 10th Streets, occupied an entire city block and employed hundreds of clerks. Smaller shops, markets, and street vendors served working-class neighborhoods, offering goods at various price points and qualities. Pushcart vendors hawked everything from food to used clothing, creating informal economies that operated in the interstices of the formal commercial system. Street markets in areas like the Lower East Side bustled with activity, their noise and crowds overwhelming to those unaccustomed to such dense commercial activity. Wall Street had emerged as the nation's financial center, where banks, investment houses, and insurance companies conducted transactions that affected the entire American economy. The New York Stock Exchange, though not yet in its current building, facilitated trading in securities that financed railroads, industrial expansion, and government operations. Financial panics and manipulations periodically disrupted markets, most recently in 1869 when Fisk and Gould attempted to corner the gold market, causing widespread economic distress. Banking in 1870 remained largely unregulated, creating both opportunities for innovation and risks of instability. Private banks like those of the Morgans and Belmonts wielded enormous power, their decisions about credit and investment shaping economic development. Savings banks served working and middle-class customers, encouraging thrift and providing modest interest on deposits. The lack of a central bank or deposit insurance meant that bank failures could and did wipe out customers' savings, creating periodic financial crises. Real estate speculation drove much economic activity. As the city expanded northward, investors bought lots anticipating development, while developers erected buildings to house the growing population. Fortunes were made and lost in land deals, and the built environment bore the marks of speculative excess. Partially developed blocks, abandoned projects, and rapid cycles of construction and demolition. Transportation companies represented major economic enterprises. Horse-drawn omnibuses and streetcars carried passengers along major routes, while ferries connected Manhattan to Brooklyn and New Jersey. Cornelius Vanderbilt controlled much of the rail access to Manhattan, his power over transportation translating into vast wealth and significant influence over the city's development. Labor organization remained contested and fragile. Craft unions representing skilled workers like printers, cigar makers, and iron molders had achieved some stability and bargaining power. These organizations negotiated wages, working hours, and conditions, sometimes threatening or conducting strikes to pressure employers. Unskilled workers lacked such organization, their replaceability making collective action difficult and dangerous. The 8-hour workday had become a rallying cry for labor activists who argued that workers deserved time for rest, family, and self-improvement beyond the 10 to 12-hour days that characterized most employment. Some gains had been achieved, particularly in government employment and certain skilled trades, but the 8-hour day remained more aspiration than reality for most workers. Wages varied enormously by skill, gender, and ethnicity. Skilled craftsmen might earn $2 to $3 per day, allowing modest but secure living standards. Unskilled male laborers typically earned $1 to $1.50 daily, barely sufficient for family support. Women workers received significantly less than men for similar work, their wages often inadequate for independent survival. Children's labor, common in many industries, was compensated at even lower rates. Economic instability was a constant reality. Seasonal unemployment affected construction workers, longshoremen, and others whose work depended on weather or shipping schedules. Economic downturns could throw thousands out of work, with no safety net beyond charity and mutual aid. The Panic of 1873 loomed just ahead. Though in 1870, the economy appeared relatively prosperous to many observers, commerce extended into the night in many districts. Restaurants, saloons, theaters, and other entertainment venues created nocturnal economies that employed workers and catered to various classes. The Bowery, in particular, hosted a raucous nightlife of concert saloons, variety theaters, and dance halls that attracted working-class patrons and middle-class slummers seeking excitement in transgressive spaces. Corruption pervaded commercial life, from customs officials who could be bribed to ignore tariff regulations, to building inspectors who overlooked violations, to politicians who granted franchises and contracts in exchange for payoffs. The Tweed Ring, at the height of its power in 1870, systematically looted the city treasury through inflated contracts and fraudulent bills, extracting millions while providing some services and employment that maintained popular support among working-class constituencies. Chapter 4. Politics, Governance, and the Tweed Ring. Political life in New York during 1870 was dominated by one of the most notorious machines in American history, Tammany Hall, led by William M. Tweed. Understanding the city's governance requires examining both the formal structures of municipal government and the informal networks of patronage and corruption that actually directed much urban policy. New York's municipal government consisted of a mayor, a common council, and various boards and departments responsible for services like police, fire protection, public works, and health. On paper, this structure resembled democratic governance in other American cities. In practice, Tammany Hall controlled most municipal offices through a combination of immigrant voter mobilization, strategic patronage, and systematic corruption. William M. Tweed, known as Boss Tweed, served as president of the Board of Supervisors and wielded influence far beyond his formal position. A large, charismatic man who had risen from volunteer firefighter to political kingpin, Tweed understood that political power in immigrant-heavy New York required providing services and assistance to working-class voters while extracting wealth from the municipal treasury and private interests seeking city contracts. Tammany Hall operated as a political club within the Democratic Party, but its influence extended throughout city governance. The organization maintained clubhouses in every ward, where district leaders cultivated relationships with residents, assisting with jobs, housing, legal troubles, and other needs. When elections arrived, these constituents voted as directed, ensuring Tammany's control over city offices. One end, the Tweed Ring's financial operations involved systematic fraud on a massive scale. City contractors were required to inflate their bills, with the excess being divided among ring members. The construction of the New York County Courthouse, begun in 1861 and still incomplete in 1870, became the most infamous example. A building that should have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars generated bills totaling millions, with the surplus filling Tweed and his associates' pockets. Patronage appointments ensured loyalty throughout the municipal workforce. Tammany controlled hiring for city jobs from street cleaners to department heads, creating an army of employees who owed their positions to the machine. His patronage system provided employment for loyal party members while ensuring the city workers mobilized voters during elections. Immigrant communities, particularly the Irish, formed Tammany's base. The machine's ward heelers assisted new arrivals with naturalization, helped them find housing and employment, and provided assistance during emergencies. This practical support earned genuine loyalty, even as reformers denounced Tammany's corruption. For many working-class immigrants, Tweed's organization provided more tangible benefits than any reform movement. Opposition to Tammany came from various quarters. The Republican Party maintained some strength in wealthier wards, advocating for business interests and reform. Protestant reformers viewed Tammany as a Catholic-Irish conspiracy that threatened American institutions. Good government advocates argued for civil service reform, honest administration, and separation of politics from municipal services. The press played an increasingly important role in exposing corruption. The New York Times, under George Jones, published investigations of Tweed ring finances, while Harper's Weekly featured Thomas Nast's devastating political cartoons that portrayed Tweed and his associates as vultures feeding on the city. These exposés had limited immediate impact, as Tammany controlled enough votes to withstand criticism, but they laid groundwork for future action. Police administration illustrated both the challenges of urban governance and the opportunities for corruption. The Metropolitan Police, created in 1857, operated under state rather than city control, a reform meant to reduce political interference. Yet patronage still influenced appointments and assignments, and police officers often had arrangements with gambling houses, brothels, and illegal liquor sellers, collecting regular payments in exchange for tolerance. Fire protection combined volunteer and professional elements. Volunteer fire companies had long served as social clubs and political organizations, their members gaining status and connections through their service. Professional paid firefighters were beginning to replace volunteers, but the transition remained incomplete and contentious. Fire companies still competed with each other, sometimes fighting over who got to extinguish a blaze while buildings burned. Public works projects offered opportunities for both genuine improvement and massive graft. Street paving, sewer construction, park development, and building projects employed thousands while enriching contractors and politicians. The question was always whether the work was actually necessary, honestly bid, and competently executed, or whether it served primarily to generate fraudulent bills. Health administration struggled with overwhelming challenges: crowded tenements, inadequate sanitation, impure water, and food adulteration created constant disease threats. The Metropolitan Board of Health, created in 1866 following a cholera epidemic, attempted to enforce sanitary regulations, but lacked sufficient resources and faced resistance from landlords and businesses whose practices violated health codes. Education policy divided along class and ethnic lines. The public school system was expanding, offering free education that reformers touted as essential for democratic citizenship and immigrant assimilation. Yet schools remained segregated by race, and Catholic immigrants resented Protestant influences in public education, leading to the development of separate Catholic schools. Debates over school funding, curriculum, and control reflected broader social tensions. Voting itself was often fraudulent. Tammany employed various tactics to ensure favorable outcomes. Naturalization fraud created new citizens who voted as directed. Repeat voting sent individuals to multiple polling places, and ballot manipulation ensured desired results. Election day often featured violence and intimidation, with gangs supporting different factions battling for control of voting locations. The relationship between city and state governments created ongoing conflicts. New York State's legislature held ultimate authority over the city, and upstate Republican legislators often imposed policies on the Democratic-dominated metropolis. This tension between home rule and state control complicated governance and provided convenient excuses when reforms failed or corruption flourished. By 1870, pressure was building for change, reformers were organizing, newspapers were investigating, and some members of the business community had concluded that Tammany's corruption had become too expensive and destabilizing. The ring's power appeared unshakable, but within a year, revelations would emerge that would bring down Tweed and temporarily reform city governance. Chapter 5. Daily Life, Culture, and Entertainment. Daily Life in 1870. New York varied dramatically depending on class, ethnicity, and occupation, yet certain rhythms and experiences united the city's diverse inhabitants. The day typically began early, with working people rising before dawn to begin long shifts, while wealthier residents enjoyed more leisurely mornings. Breakfast for working-class families might consist of bread, perhaps with butter or molasses, and tea or coffee. Better-off households enjoyed eggs, bacon, fresh bread, and various preserved fruits. Middle and upper-class families employed servants who prepared and served meals, while working families often ate quickly before rushing to employment. Transportation shaped daily routines. Most working people walked to their jobs, living in neighborhoods close to factories, docks, or commercial districts. Those who could afford the 5-cent fare took horse-drawn streetcars or omnibuses along major routes. Wealthier residents maintained private carriages, using them for social calls, shopping, and recreation. Streetcars pulled by teams of horses ran on iron rails along major avenues and cross streets, their routes expanding steadily as the city grew. Passengers crowded aboard, hanging from straps while the cars swayed and lurched. In winter, riders froze. In summer, they sweltered. Accidents occurred regularly as cars collided, horses fell, or vehicles derailed. The thousands of horses required for urban transport created their own problems, generating tons of manure daily, while frequently dying in harness. The workday consumed most of people's waking hours. Factory workers typically labored from 7 in the morning until 6 in the evening, 6 days per week. Domestic servants worked even longer hours, on call from early morning until their employers retired for the night. Office clerks and shop workers maintained similar schedules, while merchants and professionals enjoyed somewhat more full flexibility. Lunchtime offered brief respite. Working men might visit a saloon for a free lunch, salty, and designed to encourage drinking but providing needed sustenance. Women workers often brought food from home, eating at their workplaces. Oyster houses, quick lunch counters, and street vendors fed the working population cheaply and quickly. Evening brought different experiences to different classes. Working families returned to tenements where women prepared simple suppers, often stews or soups that could be extended to feed many mouths. Children played in streets and alleys, as cramped apartments offered little space for activity. Men might visit saloons, combining drinking with socializing, political discussion, and access to newspapers. Middle-class domesticity centered on the evening meal and family time. Parlors served as spaces for reading, music, and receiving visitors. Pianos were common in middle-class homes, and family members were expected to provide their own entertainment through singing, recitation, or games. Reading aloud from novels or newspapers offered shared entertainment and education. Upper-class evenings involved elaborate rituals of dining, dressing for social events, and cultivating networks through carefully choreographed social interaction. Multi-course dinners served by uniformed staff could last hours, followed by entertainments or visits to the opera, theater, or social clubs. The wealthy changed clothing multiple times daily, each activity requiring specific attire that signaled status and conformity to social codes. Newspapers provided connection to the wider world and entertainment. By 1870, New York had numerous daily papers representing various political perspectives and ethnic communities. The New York Herald, Tribune, Times, Sun, and World competed for readers with sensational stories, political coverage, and classified advertisements. Ethnic papers in German, Irish, and other languages served immigrant communities. Reading habits varied by class and education. Working-class readers favored sensational story papers featuring crime, adventure, and romance. Middle-class readers consumed novels, magazines like Harper's and Atlantic Monthly, and religious publications. Wealthy families maintained libraries and subscribed to literary journals. Public libraries were beginning to develop, though most required fees or memberships that excluded poorer residents. Saloons served as crucial social institutions for working-class men, offering not just alcohol but space for conversation, political organizing, and mutual aid. Every neighborhood had numerous saloons, some respectable establishments where working men gathered after shifts, others rougher places associated with gambling, prostitution, and violence. Reformers saw saloons as threats to family stability and social order, while working men viewed them as necessary refuges from crowded homes and difficult labor. Beer gardens catered to German immigrants, offering outdoor spaces where entire families could socialize over beer, music, and simple food. These establishments contrasted with saloons' masculine environment, creating family-oriented recreation that preserved cultural traditions while adapting to American urban life. Concert saloons and variety theaters provided entertainment along the Bowery and in other working-class districts. These venues featured musical performances, comedy acts, and displays that mixed legitimate entertainment with sexual titillation. Middle-class reformers condemned them as degrading, but working-class audiences enjoyed their raucous energy and accessibility. Legitimate theaters concentrated around Union Square and along Broadway, offering everything from Shakespeare to melodramas to musical extravaganzas. Wallach's, the Park Theater, and other establishments catered to middle and upper-class audiences willing to pay higher ticket prices for more refined entertainment. Theater-going was a major social activity, with audiences dressing formally and using attendance to display status. Opera represented the pinnacle of cultural prestige. The Academy of Music on 14th Street hosted performances that attracted the social elite, who used their boxes to see and be seen, as much as to enjoy the music. Opera subscriptions and attendance served as markers of cultural sophistication and social position, separating cultivated elites from common masses. Museums and educational institutions offered improving entertainment. Barnum's American Museum, before its destruction by fire in 1868, had been a hugely popular attraction featuring curiosities, performances, and exhibits. The Metropolitan Museum of Art would not be founded until 1870, but private collections and smaller museums offered access to art and artifacts for those interested in culture. Religious observance structured many people's weeks. Sunday brought church attendance for Catholics, Protestants, and Jews, with services reflecting denominational and ethnic differences. Churches served social and charitable functions beyond worship, organizing relief efforts, social events, and mutual aid societies. Religious affiliation often correlated with ethnicity and class, creating networks of association and support. Street life provided constant spectacle and entertainment. Vendors hawked wares with distinctive cries. Organ grinders and musicians performed for coins. Children played improvised games, and crowds gathered around street preachers, political speakers, or fights. The sensory density of urban streets overwhelmed newcomers, but provided endless interest for those accustomed to city life. Parks offered limited respite from urban density. Beyond Central Park, smaller squares and parks dotted the city, though working-class neighborhoods generally lacked such amenities. When weather permitted, families might picnic in available green spaces, though most recreation happened in streets and neighborhoods rather than dedicated park areas. Bathing remained infrequent for most New Yorkers. Few tenements had any bathing facilities, and even middle-class homes often lacked proper bathrooms. Public bathhouses existed but were neither numerous nor popular enough to serve the entire population. Weekly bathing was common among those who could manage it, but daily bathing remained a luxury of the wealthy. Seasonal rhythms affected city life. Summer heat drove those who could afford it to leave the city for cooler locations. Working people sweltered in tenements and factories, with heat-related deaths common during severe weather. Winter brought different hardships, as inadequate heating, expensive fuel, and poor construction made tenements bitterly cold. Snow and ice made streets treacherous and further complicated were already difficult transportation. Chapter 6. Public Health, Crime, and Social Problems. New York in 1870 faced enormous challenges regarding public health, crime, and social disorder that stemmed from rapid growth, dense population, and inadequate infrastructure. These problems affected different populations unequally, but threatened everyone to some degree, creating ongoing crises that tested the capacity of both government and civil society. Disease was a constant presence in urban life. Cholera, typhoid, typhus, smallpox, tuberculosis, and countless other ailments killed thousands annually. The crowded, unsanitary conditions in tenement districts created ideal environments for disease transmission, while inadequate medical knowledge and treatment meant that even simple infections could prove fatal. Infant and child mortality rates were shockingly high by modern standards. Perhaps 1 in 5 children died before their 5th birthday, with rates even higher in the poorest neighborhoods. Diarrheal diseases, respiratory infections, and childhood illnesses like measles and scarlet fever took enormous tolls. Women faced significant risk from childbirth, with maternal mortality remaining common despite advances in medical knowledge. The Metropolitan Board of Health, created in response to the cholera epidemic of 1866, represented a relatively new approach to public health governance. The board had authority to enforce sanitary regulations, inspect buildings, quarantine the sick, and require improvements to conditions that threatened public health. Yet, it faced enormous challenges: inadequate funding, resistance from landlords and businesses, and the sheer scale of problems requiring attention. Tenement conditions were particularly dire. Buildings designed to extract maximum rent from minimum space housed families in apartments with poor ventilation, inadequate light, no bathrooms, and minimal maintenance. Indoor plumbing was rare, with residents sharing outdoor privies or using chamber pots that were emptied into streets or yards. Water came from shared pumps that often drew from contaminated sources. Garbage and waste management barely existed in many neighborhoods,